The sun was dipping low over the wide Wyoming plains, bleeding orange and gold into the horizon. The little town of Dusty Creek stood quiet at the edge of the world, a cluster of wood plank buildings surrounded by miles of empty land and whispering sagebrush. The only sounds were the creak of a signboard in the wind, and the faint clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoing down the main street. It was the kind of town where every man carried a story, and every woman carried more than her share of secrets. Down near the livery stable, a cowboy rode in slow. His horse was worn, his boots dust-caked, and his eyes heavy with the look of a man who'd seen too much and trusted too little. Folks didn't know much about him, only that he'd been drifting from ranch to ranch working odd jobs for enough coin to get by. He was tall, quiet, and carried himself with the kind of patience that comes from years of solitude. When he spoke, it was soft but sure, like a man who didn't need to prove anything. He tied his horse outside the general store and brushed the trail dust off his hat. Inside, the place smelled of flour, tobacco, and kerosene. Old Mr. Greeley was behind the counter fussing with the ledger and barely looked up when the cowboy walked in. "Afternoon," the cowboy said. Mr. Greeley nodded. "You looking for work, son, or just passing through?" "Guess that depends what's needed," came the reply. The old man studied him for a moment, then leaned forward. "There's a ranch out east of town, Cougar Ridge. Owner's short-handed. Lost a hand last month, another left for Kansas. You look like you can ride and mend fence." "I can do both," the cowboy said simply. Mr. Greeley scribbled a quick note and tore it from the ledger. "Take this to the ranch. Tell him I sent you, and if you're smart, don't go asking too many questions about the owner." The cowboy tipped his hat and stepped out into the fading light. He didn't ask questions, never had much use for them, but he felt something in the way the old man said it, like there was more to that ranch than just cattle and hard work. By the time he reached Cougar Ridge, dusk had settled over the land. The wind carried the scent of hay and wood smoke, and a lantern flickered near the barn. He could see a figure moving by the corral, a woman, bent over a bucket, scrubbing something with strong, deliberate strokes. When she straightened, the light caught her face. She wasn't what most men would call pretty. Her features were plain, her hair tied back tight, and her hands looked like they'd seen more work than rest. But there was a steadiness about her, something real, unpolished, and honest. She looked at him from across the yard. "You the new hand?" "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Mr. Greeley sent me." She nodded and motioned toward the house. "Supper's almost ready. You can stable your horse and wash up. We eat at dark." Inside the house, the air was thick with the smell of stew and fresh bread. A small fire crackled in the hearth, throwing soft shadows across the room. There wasn't much in the way of decoration, just a few old photographs, a Bible on the table, and a faded quilt draped over the rocker. It was a simple place but warm, and for the first time in a long while, the cowboy felt the faint pull of belonging. When the woman set the pot on the table, she caught him looking around. "Ain't much," she said, her tone rough but not unkind. "But it keeps the cold out." "It's more than I've had some nights," he admitted, pulling off his hat. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the scrape of spoons against tin bowls. Then she spoke again, half smiling, though her eyes stayed guarded. "Most men come through here expecting a fine ranch wife with ribbons in her hair and a soft voice. I ain't that. I ain't pretty, but I can cook." The cowboy looked up at her then, studying her face in the firelight. There was something honest about the way she said it. No self-pity, just truth. "Pretty don't feed a man after 12 hours in the saddle," he said quietly, "and I reckon I've eaten worse." She laughed, just a small sound rough from disuse. "Well, that's something." Over the next few days, he worked the fences, rode the pastures, and kept mostly to himself. But each evening he found himself drawn back to that kitchen, drawn to her. She'd talk while she cooked, telling bits of her life between stirs of the pot. She'd been widowed young, left to run the ranch alone after her husband was thrown from a horse. The land was all she had left, and she fought to keep it from being swallowed by debt and drought. He never said much in return, but he listened. The way she spoke about the land, the animals, the weather, like they were all part of her, stirred something in him he hadn't felt in years. One evening, as the sky turned lavender and the coyotes began to cry in the distance, she stepped out onto the porch with 2 mugs of coffee. He was sitting there, sharpening his knife, his hat tipped low. "You work hard," she said softly, handing him a mug. "Don't talk much, though." He smiled faintly. "Never saw much sense in words that don't mean something." She looked at him for a long moment, then turned her gaze toward the hills. You ever think about settling down? He hesitated. Can't say I have. Ain't much in my life worth settling to. Well, she said, wrapping her hands around the mug, maybe you just ain't found the right reason yet. The silence stretched between them, filled with crickets and the hum of the prairie wind. Somewhere deep inside, he felt that strange stirring again, like the land itself was trying to speak through her voice. The days turned to weeks, and the work went on. They fixed fences together, drove cattle, weathered a storm that nearly took down the barn. Somewhere in all that, the quiet understanding between them deepened into something neither could quite name. She'd catch him watching her sometimes, his eyes soft, almost uncertain, and she'd turn away before he could see her blush. But not all eyes in Dusty Creek were kind. Folks talked. They whispered about the widow and the drifter, about how a man like him had no business staying that long at any ranch that wasn't his own. And when talk travels in a small town, it has a way of turning sharp. One evening, when he rode into town for supplies, he heard it himself. Two men at the saloon, talking loud enough for anyone to catch. She thinks she's found herself a savior, one of them sneered. Man like that'll take what he wants and ride off come spring. The cowboy said nothing, just turned and walked out into the cold. But his jaw was tight, and something dark flickered behind his eyes. When he got back to the ranch, the sky was heavy with clouds. He found her on the porch again, waiting. She could tell something was wrong. Bad news? She asked. He took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair. Just talk, the kind that don't mean nothing but still cuts deep. She sighed. Folks around here been talking since my husband passed. They don't like what they don't understand. He looked at her then. Really looked. You ever get tired of fighting them? Every day, she admitted. But I don't quit easy. A crack of thunder rolled over the hills, and the first drops of rain began to fall. He stepped closer, close enough to see the reflection of lightning in her eyes. Maybe, he said slowly. Some fights ain't meant to be fought alone. She held his gaze. Her breath caught halfway between fear and something deeper. The rain began to fall harder, drumming on the porch roof. She didn't move. And in that moment, between the thunder, the silence, and the wild wind rushing through the valley, something changed. Neither of them spoke, but both knew that whatever was coming next would test them in ways neither had faced before. The storm broke full across the ridge, and the night swallowed the ranch whole. The rain came down steady through the night, washing the dust from the land and soaking the earth until it smelled rich and alive again. The wind howled through the cottonwoods, rattling the windows and making the lanterns flicker inside the little house at Cougar Ridge. She stood by the fire, wrapping her shawl tight around her shoulders, watching the cowboy as he pulled off his wet coat and set it by the hearth. Neither spoke for a long while. The thunder rolled, and the logs hissed as the rain leaked through the old roof. The air between them carried a weight that wasn't just from the storm. He finally said, quiet but sure, "You shouldn't be out here alone through weather like this. A place this far from town, someone could take advantage." She gave a faint smile, tired and proud. Been taking care of myself for near 5 years now. Storms don't scare me none. He studied her, the way she stood firm even when the wind rattled the door. Ain't talking about storms, he said. Her eyes flicked up to meet his, but she didn't ask what he meant. Maybe she already knew. The next morning dawned gray and heavy. The ranch was quiet, except for the dripping eaves and the restless low of the cattle penned close to the barn. The cowboy saddled his horse early, riding out to check the far fence line. The storm had done its damage. Poles down, wires snapped, tracks of coyotes cutting through the mud. He worked without complaint, his gloves slick with rainwater and rust. But while he patched the line, his thoughts kept drifting back to the house, to her voice in the firelight, to the way she'd looked at him when he'd said she shouldn't fight alone. There was something in her, something strong but lonely too, like a wind that had been blowing too long without rest. By midday, the sun burned through the clouds, turning the wet fields into a shimmer of gold. When he rode back, he found her in the yard, spreading blankets to dry on the rail. She glanced up and smiled faintly. "You look like the storm didn't get the better of you." "Storm's nothing new," he said, swinging down from the saddle. "But that fence out east needs new posts." "Coyotes been nosing around again," she frowned. "They've been bold this season. Lost 2 calves last week. I'll set traps along the ridge tonight," he said. "You got any lantern oil left?" "Half a jug," she replied. "You can take it." They talked like that, Simple, steady words, the kind that carried meaning between the spaces. Every day brought small exchanges, but every night, after the chores were done and the sky turned quiet, those silences between them grew heavier, deeper, almost like a promise waiting to be spoken. But not all was calm on the ridge. Word from town began to drift up with the supply wagon. Word that a land agent from Cheyenne had been asking about her property. Folks said the railroad men were hungry for land, looking to buy up ranches between Dusty Creek and the mountains. And Cougar Ridge, sitting right between the new survey lines, was worth more than she knew. When she mentioned it over supper one evening, the cowboy set his spoon down slow. "You think someone's trying to buy you out?" She shook her head. "Don't know. Got a letter last month. Said they'd pay fair. I tossed it in the fire." He studied her face. "That might have been a mistake." Her eyes narrowed a little. "You think I should sell?" "No," he said. "I think whoever sent that letter might not take kindly to being refused." The look that passed between them was long and heavy. She didn't say it, but he could tell she'd been feeling it too. The sense of being watched. The shadows that seemed to linger near the barn after dark. That night, when the wind picked up again, he stayed outside. He lit a lantern and made rounds near the fence line, listening. The coyotes were out there, sure enough, but there was something else too. A faint sound of hoofbeats out on the ridge, far beyond where any stock should be. He stood still, the rain tapping against his hat brim, until the sound faded into the distance. When he came back to the porch, she was waiting. "You hear something?" He nodded slowly. "Riders. Just one or two, maybe. Didn't come close, but they weren't herdin'." Her jaw tightened. "I told you before. Folks in town don't like me much." "Maybe they're just curious." He looked out into the dark. "Curiosity don't ride this far in the rain." She didn't answer. They both knew there was more to it, but neither dared say what. The days that followed were tense. He worked harder than before, fixing the barn roof, checking the stock, keeping an eye on the hills. She went about her chores quietly, but he could see the worry creeping into her eyes. One afternoon, he found a fresh set of hoofprints by the creek, a single rider, judging by the depth. The trail led toward the back pasture, then vanished near the old fence. Whoever it was had been watching the ranch. That night, when he came in, she was sitting at the table with a folded letter in her hands. "This came today," she said, sliding it toward him. The paper was fancy, embossed with a company seal from Cheyenne. The letter said the land was under claim review, that new ownership papers had been filed. His stomach knotted as he read. "They're trying to take it legal," he said. "And if they can't, they'll find another way." Her face went pale. "This land's all I got. I buried my husband here. Every board, every fence post I built with my own hands." He looked at her, seeing the fight and the fear tangled together. "Then they'll have to come through me first." Something in his voice made her eyes soften, though she tried to hide it. "You don't owe me that," she said quietly. He smiled faintly. "Maybe not. But I reckon some debts ain't about owing." The wind rattled the shutters again, and for a moment neither spoke. Then, soft as a whisper, she said, "You don't even know why my husband died, do you?" He looked at her sharply. "You said he was thrown from a horse." She hesitated, eyes flicking toward the window as though afraid someone might be listening. "That's what I told folks. Truth is, it wasn't no accident. He was shot. Found him by the north fence, still in the saddle." The cowboy's hand tightened around the edge of the table. "Who?" "I don't know," she said. "Sheriff said it was bandits passing through. But I knew better. There was something he'd been hiding, some papers he kept locked away. After he died, they disappeared." He leaned back slowly, the pieces starting to fit together in his mind. "Those papers might have had to do with this land." "That's what I figure," she said. "Maybe he was trying to keep someone from taking it." He stared into the fire, his jaw set. "If they killed once to get it, they might try again." The words hung in the air like smoke. Outside, the wind began to howl again, and far off across the valley a faint light flickered, too steady to be lightning, too far to be a lantern from town. He moved to the window, watching. "There," he said quietly. "You see that?" She came beside him, following his gaze. A single light moved slowly along the ridge, disappearing behind the rise. Her breath caught. "They're back." He turned to her, his voice low but steady. "Get your rifle and keep it close. I'll take the horse and circle from behind. Whoever's out there, they ain't out for a friendly call." She shook her head. "You go out there alone, you might not come back." He gave a faint smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "I've been not coming back my whole life." Before she could answer, he was gone, out the door, into the wind and dark. She watched from the porch, clutching her shawl tight as the thunder rolled again. The lantern light from the ridge flickered once more, then vanished. She stood there long after he disappeared into the night, listening to the sound of hoofbeats fading into the storm. Every part of her wanted to believe he'd come back, but deep down, she knew that something had changed forever, that the trouble which had haunted her for years had finally come home to the ridge. And somewhere out in the dark, between the thunder and the echo of hooves, a gun cocked softly, just once before the rain swallowed the sound whole. The night stretched on, thick with rain and fear. The lantern in the kitchen burned low, its flame trembling as if it knew the storm outside wasn't just of weather. She sat by the window, watching the darkness swallow the ridge. Every few minutes she thought she heard hoofbeats, or the faint echo of a man's voice carried on the wind. But then it would fade, and all she'd hear was the rain tapping against the glass. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She tried to steady them by holding a cup of coffee, but the warmth didn't reach her fingers. Somewhere out there, the cowboy was alone, tracking whoever had been watching the ranch, and she couldn't shake the thought that maybe this was how it had happened before. Her husband riding out into the dark, never coming back. When the clock on the wall struck midnight, she rose and crossed the room. She opened the drawer by the stove and took out a worn revolver, its metal dull from age. She checked the chambers, 3 bullets left. Not much, but it was something. She'd learned to shoot after her husband's death, though she never spoke of it. Folks in town said it wasn't fitting for a woman to carry a gun, but folks in town didn't live as far from help as she did. The wind rattled the door hard enough to make her jump. She lifted the pistol, heart pounding, but it was only the latch slipping. She set her jaw, fastened it tight again, and turned down the lamp. The room fell into half shadow. She stood there in the dark for a long moment, listening to the ranch creak and breathe around her. Then, faint but certain, came the sound of a horse. She moved to the porch, holding her breath. Through the sheets of rain, she saw a shape moving down the ridge. One rider. Her chest eased just a little. It was him. She could tell by the way he sat the saddle, straight but weary. He was soaked through when he reached the porch, his hat dripping and his coat plastered to his back. "You're hurt," she said when she saw the blood on his sleeve. "It's not mine," he answered, stepping inside. His voice was low, steady, but his eyes told a different story. "There's 2 men out there. Didn't see their faces, but they're camped not far off, waiting for dawn. One of them took a shot when I circled close." Her stomach turned cold. "You think they're after the deed?" "I think they're after you," he said quietly. "They're working for whoever sent that letter. They know you wouldn't sell." She stared at him, the color draining from her face. "Then what do we do?" He looked toward the window, where the first hint of gray light was creeping in from the horizon. "We wait. When the sun's up, we'll see where they're hiding. But tonight you stay inside. Don't open that door for anyone." She nodded, though she could see the exhaustion in him. He hadn't slept, and the tension in his jaw said he wouldn't anytime soon. When he finally sat by the fire, she brought him a blanket and a cup of hot coffee. He accepted it with a nod but said nothing. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the soft crackle of wood. Then she spoke, her voice quiet. "You ever lose someone before?" He looked up slowly, meeting her gaze. "Once, long time ago. She wanted a man who'd stay put. I wasn't that man." She studied him. "And now?" He looked into the fire. "Now I'm starting to think maybe I should have been." For a moment she almost smiled. But then the sound of thunder rolled low across the hills again, reminding them both that morning was coming. And with it, danger. When dawn broke, the storm had passed, leaving a silver mist over the valley. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. He saddled his horse quietly, strapping his rifle to the saddle. She came out onto the porch, her shawl pulled tight around her. "You shouldn't go alone," she said. "I won't be far," he told her. "Just need to see what they're up to. If they're planning to come down, we'll know soon enough." Before he rode off, she reached out and caught his arm. "Be careful," she said softly. He nodded once, then rode toward the ridge, his figure fading into the mist. She stood there long after he'd gone, her mind spinning. She couldn't stop thinking about those men in the hills, how they knew her name, how they'd been watching. And then another thought hit her, sharp and cold. What if it wasn't just the land they wanted? What if her husband had died over something bigger? She went inside and started searching through the desk drawers. Old letters, receipts, yellowed pages that smelled of dust. Near the bottom, she found an envelope sealed with wax, hidden beneath a false panel. Inside were several folded papers covered in her husband's handwriting, and a map of the valley with lines drawn in red ink. At the edge of the paper were 3 words: mineral rights claim. Her hands trembled. She remembered now, he had mentioned once years ago about a spring up north that carried a strange color in the rocks. She hadn't thought much of it then, but if there were minerals on this land, it would explain everything. She looked toward the window, heart pounding. If those men knew, they wouldn't stop until they owned it, or until no one was left to claim it. Meanwhile, out on the ridge, the cowboy had found the camp. 2 horses were tied near a fallen tree, steam rising from their backs. The men were crouched near a dying fire, rifles close. He recognized one of them, a man he'd seen in Dusty Creek a week earlier, wearing a railroad badge on his coat. He crept closer, crouching behind a rock. Their voices carried low through the mist. "Boss says we take the papers and burn the place if we have to," one said. "Ain't no one gonna miss a widow out here." The cowboy's grip tightened on his rifle. He waited, steady as stone, until they mounted up and rode toward the ridge. Then he turned back down the slope, cutting across the trail to get ahead of them. Back at the ranch, she had gathered the papers into a small bundle and hidden them beneath the floorboard near the stove. Her hands were just settling the plank when she heard the sound of horses again. Too many for one man. She ran to the window. 2 riders were approaching from the ridge. Her breath caught. The cowboy was nowhere in sight. She snatched up the revolver and stood by the door, every nerve in her body trembling. The men dismounted and began walking toward the porch. "Ma'am," one called out, voice slick and false. "We're from the land office. Need to speak with you about your deed." She didn't answer. The second man stepped closer. "Ain't looking for trouble, just a signature." She could see now that their coats were dry. They hadn't come through rain this morning. They'd been close all along. The first man tried the door. "Open up, ma'am." "Be easier that way." Her finger rested on the trigger. "You take one more step and you'll regret it." A pause. Then a low chuckle. "Lady, you ain't got the nerve." But before he could move again, a rifle cracked from the ridge. The man jerked back, his hat flying off as the bullet split the post beside him. The cowboy's voice echoed down the slope, cold and sharp. "Next one's not a warning." The men spun and bolted for their horses. The cowboy rode down hard, cutting across their path. They fired once, twice, the bullets whistling past his shoulder. He ducked low, spurred his horse, and charged. The sound of hooves and gunfire filled the valley until one of the men tumbled from his saddle, the other fleeing into the trees. When the noise finally died, the only sound left was the wind. The cowboy dismounted, breathing hard. The woman came running from the porch, eyes wide. "You all right?" she asked. He nodded, though his arm was bleeding again. "They won't be back for a while. But they'll tell whoever sent them that we know." She swallowed hard. "Then what happens next?" He looked toward the ridge, where smoke from the gunfire still drifted thin against the pale sky. "Next," he said slowly, "we find out just what your husband died for, and who's still willing to kill for it." The words sank into her chest like a stone. She looked back at the small, quiet house, the place she'd fought to keep, the land she'd bled for, and realized it was no longer just home. It was a battlefield. As the day wore on, they buried the dead man by the creek and burned what was left of his camp. Neither spoke much. The air between them was tight, heavy with the unspoken truth that more men would come. That night, when darkness fell again, they sat by the fire, both lost in thought. Outside, the coyotes howled, and the wind moved through the dry grass like a whisper. She reached across the table, her hand resting just near his. "I should have told you sooner," she said softly. "About the papers, about the claim." He met her eyes. "You were scared." "Can't blame you for that," she hesitated. "You think we got a chance?" He looked into the flames, his face carved with shadows. "Ain't about chance," he said. "It's about holding on till the last man standing." The fire crackled, and somewhere outside, a horse neighed, a sound too close, too sudden to be one of theirs. She froze. He reached for his rifle. The night outside went still, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Then came a voice, calm and cold, from just beyond the door. "Evenin', folks. You've made quite a mess for my men." Her blood ran cold. The cowboy raised his rifle, eyes narrowing. The voice continued, smoother now, almost friendly. "Let's talk business," it said, "before someone else gets hurt." And just like that, the storm that had started on Cougar Ridge was far from over. The cowboy froze, his finger resting lightly on the trigger as the voice drifted through the thin wood of the door. The tone was smooth, too calm, too certain. It wasn't the voice of a hired gun or a drifter. It was a man used to giving orders, used to getting what he wanted. The woman's breath hitched. She looked at the cowboy, fear flashing in her eyes. "That's him," she whispered. "The one who sent the letters." The cowboy tilted his head, listening. Outside, the horses snorted and boots shuffled on the porch. There were more of them, 3, maybe 4. He could hear the weight of their steps, the metallic clink of rifles being shifted from one hand to another. The house was small, 1 door, 2 windows, no back exit worth using without being seen. He stepped closer to her and spoke low. "You stay down. Don't move till I say." Her hand clutched at his sleeve. "You can't take them all." He gave a faint, grim smile. "Ain't the first time someone said that." The voice outside called again, louder now. "You've had your fun, cowboy. You shot one of my men and I can overlook that, for now. But I'll have those papers one way or another. I suggest you open the door before things turn unpleasant." The cowboy's eyes flicked to the table where her revolver still lay. He handed it to her. "If they break through, you shoot straight. Don't think, just pull." She nodded, her hands trembling, but there was a fierce light in her eyes now. The fear was still there, but something stronger had risen with it. Something like defiance. Outside, the leader spoke again, his tone colder. "Last chance, folks. I got 3 men out here ready to light this place up if you don't step outside." The cowboy's jaw tightened. He knew men like this, cowards hiding behind money and muscle. He'd seen their kind ruin whole towns, taking what they wanted under the name of progress. The railroad had made men rich, but it had made others dangerous. He took a slow breath, steadying his voice. "You say you want to talk," he called out. "Then talk." There was a pause. Then the door creaked as someone pushed it open halfway. A tall man stepped into the frame, coat dark with rain, hat pulled low over sharp eyes. He wasn't much older than the cowboy, but there was something about him, a polish, a smoothness, that didn't belong to the rough country. His boots were clean, his gloves new, his smile practiced. "Well now," the man said, stepping inside like he owned the place. "I reckon this saves us a mess of trouble. You must be the new hand I've been hearing about." The cowboy didn't move his rifle an inch. "And you must be the man who sends hired guns to do his talking." The stranger's smile didn't falter. "Business, friend. Nothing personal. This land was promised to the company years ago. Your lady friend here just hasn't come to terms with that yet." "She ain't your lady friend," the cowboy said evenly. "And she ain't sellin'." The man sighed, glancing around the small, dim room. "You folks don't understand how things work out here. The railroad's coming through, whether you like it or not. You can sign and take the money, or we'll take it without your name on the papers. Either way, by winter this ranch will belong to us." The woman stepped out from behind the stove, the revolver shaking slightly in her hand. "You already killed once for this land. I won't let you do it again." The man's expression hardened, his charm slipping for the first time. "You should have stayed quiet, ma'am. Would have been easier that way." Before he could reach for his gun, the cowboy raised his rifle, eyes cold as stone. "Step away from that door." For a heartbeat, no one moved. The fire crackled. Thunder rolled far off over the hills, and the air between them tightened like a wire ready to snap. Then the man smiled again, slow and venomous. "You won't shoot me. You're not a killer." The cowboy's eyes didn't blink. "You sure about that?" They stared each other down for what felt like a long stretch of silence. Then the man stepped back slowly, his gloved hands raised halfway. "All right," he said. "Maybe we start over. You think you can stand against the railroad? Fine, but there's more than me coming. You can't fight what's already bought and paid for." He turned toward the door, but before he stepped out, he looked back at the woman. "You'll wish you'd signed, ma'am. By the time they're done, you'll have nothing left but ashes." When the door closed behind him, the cowboy waited, listening until the hoofbeats faded into the distance. The woman let out a shaky breath and sank into the chair. "He's not bluffing," she said quietly. "They'll come back with more men." He nodded. "That's what I'm counting on." She looked up, startled. "What do you mean?" He moved to the window, watching the empty ridge. "If they want this place bad enough, they'll come with everything they've got. And when they do, we'll have one chance to make 'em stop." She frowned, not understanding. "You mean fight?" "I mean end it," he said simply. "One way or another." For the next 2 days, the ranch was a fortress in the making. They boarded the windows, stacked feed sacks against the walls, and moved the horses into the far pen behind the barn. The woman cooked what she could spare, but her mind wasn't on the meals. Every sound, every shadow on the ridge made her heart jump. The cowboy barely slept. He scouted the hills by night, moving like a ghost through the fog, watching for signs of the men's return. Once he found a campfire still warm and fresh tracks leading toward the creek. They were closer than she knew. By the third morning, the air had gone dry and still, the kind of quiet that only came before trouble. The sky was pale and sharp, and the land seemed to hold its breath. She stood on the porch, gripping her shawl, watching him saddle his horse. "You think they'll come today?" He adjusted the rifle strap. "If I were them, I would." She hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. "You could leave, you know. Ride out now before it starts." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I could," he said softly. "But I won't." Her eyes glistened. "Why?" He hesitated, then said, "Because someone's gotta stand for something. Might as well be me." Before she could speak again, a sound cut through the still morning air. A distant rumble, faint at first, then growing. Hooves, many of them. The cowboy turned, scanning the ridge. A thin line of riders was coming down the slope, 5, maybe 6 men, their coats flapping in the wind, rifles glinting in the sun. Dust rose behind them like a ghostly trail. "They're here," he said quietly. She felt her throat tighten. "What do we do?" He glanced toward the barn. "You stay inside, keep low. Don't open that door unless I call your name." "I'm not hiding," she said, her voice trembling. He gave her a long look. "This ain't about hiding. It's about surviving." She swallowed hard and nodded. He stepped off the porch, rifle in hand, and walked out toward the yard, the morning light glinting off his belt buckle. The riders slowed as they neared the fence. Their leader, the same man from before, raising his hand. "Last chance, cowboy," he shouted. "This don't need to end bad." The cowboy's voice came back steady as stone. "It already ended bad when your men spilled blood on this land." The leader sneered and gave a sharp motion with his hand. 2 men dismounted, moving to flank the barn. Another stayed behind, watching through the scope of a rifle. Inside the house, the woman crouched low by the window, clutching the revolver. She could see him standing alone in the yard, 1 man against 6. Her heart hammered in her chest. Then the first shot rang out. It cracked through the morning like thunder. Wood splintered near the porch. She gasped, ducking low. The cowboy dove for cover behind the trough, returning fire. The men scattered, taking up positions behind the corral and the haystack. Smoke drifted across the yard, mingling with dust and sunlight. The sound of gunfire echoed across the ridge, sharp and relentless. She pressed herself against the wall, whispering a prayer she hadn't said in years. Then another thought came. If they burned the barn, the whole house would go with it. She crawled to the door, peeking out. One of the gunmen had moved closer, torch in hand. The cowboy saw him, but he was pinned by 2 others on the opposite side. Without thinking, she ran out into the open, raising the revolver with both shaking hands. "Drop it!" she shouted. The man turned, startled but too slow. She fired once, the recoil jarring through her arms. The torch fell to the ground, flames licking harmlessly at the dirt. The cowboy spun around, eyes wide. "Get back inside!" he yelled. But before she could move, another shot cracked from the ridge. The bullet struck the porch post beside her, splintering it clean through. She stumbled, heart pounding. He fired back, dropping the shooter, then sprinted toward her, dragging her behind the trough. She could feel the tremor in his hands, not from fear, but from rage. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice rough. She looked up at him, her face streaked with dust and tears. "You said someone's gotta stand for something," she whispered. "Well, I'm standing." The gunfire kept coming, closer now. The men were pushing forward, one circling wide behind the barn. The cowboy's rifle clicked empty. He cursed under his breath, grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the back door. "We can't hold here," he said. "They'll box us in." "Where do we go?" she gasped. He looked toward the old storm cellar by the shed. "There." They ran, bullets kicking up dirt at their heels. Just as they reached the cellar, a shout rang out behind them. One of the men had spotted them. The cowboy turned, firing his last bullet. The man went down hard, but not before another shot answered from the hill. The sound was deafening, and the cowboy staggered, his hand clutching his side. She screamed his name, catching him before he fell. His face was pale, his breath ragged, but his eyes burned steady. "Go," he rasped. "Get down there." "I'm not leaving you," she said fiercely, dragging him toward the cellar door. The wind whipped through the yard, carrying the smell of smoke and gunpowder. The riders were closing in, their shouts echoing across the ridge. The woman's hands fumbled at the latch, pulling it open just as another bullet tore through the air, splintering the wood beside her. She turned to him, her voice breaking. "Hold on, please." He met her gaze, a faint smile ghosting across his lips. "I ain't going anywhere." Together they slipped into the dark, the cellar door closing just as heavy boots pounded into the yard above. Outside, the ranch burned with noise and fury, and the men who'd come for Cougar Ridge had no idea that the real fight, the one that would decide everything, was still waiting in the shadows below. The cellar was cold and damp, the air thick with dust and the faint smell of earth. The woman held the cowboy close, her hands pressed to the wound on his side, trying to stop the bleeding. His breath came shallow, but his eyes stayed open, fixed on the sliver of light coming through the crack above them. "Stay still," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You'll make it worse." He gave a faint smile, his lips dry. "Ain't the first time I've been shot. Won't be the last. Don't you start talking like that," she said, her tone breaking. "You're not dying here, not after everything." Outside, boots thudded against the porch. The men were searching the house, shouting orders, kicking doors open. Smoke drifted down through the cracks, and the faint orange glow of fire flickered against the ceiling boards. The woman could hear the leader's voice, calm and cruel as ever, giving commands. "They're still here somewhere. Check the barn. Check the creek. Find them." She gripped the cowboy's hand tighter. "They'll burn us alive if we stay." He forced himself upright, wincing. "No. There's another way." He pointed toward the far corner where a small tunnel had been dug long ago, leading out behind the shed. "Used for root storage. If it's still open, it'll get us to the backfield." She helped him to his feet, his arm draped over her shoulder. The tunnel was narrow, the dirt cold under their hands as they crawled through. Every movement sent pain through him, but he didn't make a sound. He just kept moving forward, inch by inch, until the faint moonlight shone at the other end. They came out behind a thicket of brush near the corral. Smoke rolled through the air and the ranch house burned in a dull orange glow. The sight hit her like a knife. Everything she'd built, everything her father had left her, was turning to ash. She wanted to cry, but the cowboy's hand squeezed hers, grounding her. "Don't look back," he said softly. "We'll rebuild." She nodded, swallowing hard, then helped him to the small grove beyond the pasture. From there, they could see the riders still gathered near the fire, their voices carrying on the wind. The leader was pacing, furious. "Find them!" he barked. They couldn't have gone far. The cowboy's jaw clenched. "They'll come after us again. They won't stop till one of us is gone." She turned to him, her eyes steady despite the tears. "Then we ended." He looked at her, something fierce sparking behind his pain. "You sure?" "I've lost too much already," she said quietly. "I won't run anymore." They moved carefully through the brush until they reached the back of the corral. The cowboy checked the rifle, one last bullet left, and handed her the revolver. "If it comes to it," he said, "you don't hesitate." She nodded. They waited, the minutes stretching like hours. The wind carried the sound of men arguing, and then the leader stepped away from the fire, heading toward the barn alone. The cowboy motioned for her to stay low. He slipped through the shadows, his steps slow and deliberate. The pain in his side burned with every breath, but his focus never wavered. The man reached the barn door and pushed it open, muttering to himself. That's when the cowboy spoke. "Looking for me?" The leader spun, startled, but before he could raise his gun, the cowboy fired. The shot echoed across the valley, sharp and final. The man stumbled back, dropping his weapon, his face frozen in shock. For a moment, silence filled the air. Then chaos broke loose. The others ran toward the barn, shouting. The woman stepped from the shadows, firing the revolver to draw their attention. Bullets tore through the air, splintering wood and kicking up dirt. "Go!" she shouted. "Get to the horse!" He hesitated, torn between fighting and fleeing. But when he saw her duck behind the trough, reloading with shaking hands, he made his choice. He whistled low, and his horse, spooked but loyal, came running from the trees. He pulled her up behind him, and together they rode hard through the burning yard, past the shouts and gunfire into the open field beyond. The night swallowed them whole as they disappeared into the hills. They rode until the stars began to fade, and dawn's pale light touched the horizon. The cowboy's strength was fading fast, his shirt soaked with blood, but he kept his grip steady on the reins. Finally, when the valley lay far behind them, he slowed and stopped by a stream. She slid down, helping him off the horse, lowering him gently to the grass. "You did it," she whispered. "They're gone," he smiled weakly. "Ain't over yet. They'll come again. Maybe not tomorrow, but they will." She shook her head. "Not this time. You killed their head man. The rest'll scatter." He looked toward the sunrise, the light catching his eyes. "Reckon you might be right." She cleaned his wound as best she could, washing the blood away with the cold stream water. He winced but didn't complain. When she was done, he leaned back, breathing easier. "Guess I owe you my life," he murmured. She gave a faint smile. "You owe me breakfast when this is all over." "You still haven't tasted my biscuits proper," he chuckled, the sound low and warm. "You're something else, you know that?" Her eyes softened. "I ain't pretty," she said quietly, repeating the words she'd once said to him. "But I can cook." He turned his head toward her, a tired smile on his face. "You're wrong about that. You're the prettiest thing I ever laid eyes on, and you got more heart than anyone I've ever met." For the first time in days, she laughed. It wasn't loud or easy, but it was real. The fear and fire of the night began to fade, replaced by the faint warmth of morning and the soft rustle of wind through the grass. By noon, they found a small cabin near the river, long abandoned but still standing. It wasn't much, but it had a roof and a stove. They settled there, tending the wound and resting the horse. The quiet felt strange after so much noise, but it was welcome. The days that followed were slow. The cowboy healed bit by bit, and the woman began to rebuild, starting with what little they'd saved from the wreck. The fire had taken her home, but not her land. The soil was still good, and the creek still ran clear. Together, they started again. He fixed the fence while she mended clothes and cooked over the stove. Some evenings they'd sit outside watching the sun dip low behind the ridge, saying little but feeling the same peace neither had known in years. One morning, a rider came down the trail carrying a letter from town. It was from the land office, confirming what she had feared. The company had pulled its claim. The railroad was moving its route north. Cougar Ridge was hers again. She read the letter twice, hardly believing it, then looked at the cowboy with tears in her eyes. "We did it," she said. "It's over," he smiled, quiet and proud. "No, ma'am," he said softly. "It's just beginning." In the months that followed, the valley slowly came back to life. Neighbors from nearby towns came to help rebuild the barn, and the woman became known for her cooking. Suppers that drew cowhands from miles around. They said no one could make a stew like hers or bake bread that soft. The cowboy stayed on, fixing fences, tending cattle. And though he never said much, everyone could see the way he looked at her when she wasn't watching. It wasn't loud or showy, but it was steady, the kind of love that lasts through droughts and storms alike. One evening, as the light turned gold across the fields, he took her hand. "I ain't good with fancy words," he said, his voice low and certain. "But I reckon I don't want to ride nowhere else." "Not anymore," she smiled, eyes shining. "Then don't." And he didn't. The days grew into seasons and the ranch thrived again, built not just from sweat and soil but from something deeper. Folks in town talked about the cowboy and the woman who wouldn't sell her land, how they'd faced down the railroad and won. But to them it wasn't a legend, it was just life, one day at a time. Years later, when strangers passed through Cougar Ridge, they'd see the smoke curling from the chimney and smell the bread baking, and they'd hear laughter carried on the wind. And if they looked close, they'd see two figures sitting side by side on the porch, the woman with her quiet strength, and the cowboy who'd once wandered too far but finally found his home. The land stretched wide before them, calm and golden under the evening sun. It had seen fire and blood, loss and love, but now it belonged to peace. And though they never spoke much about the night the ranch had burned, sometimes when the wind blew from the east, she'd rest her head on his shoulder and say softly, "We made it, didn't we?" He'd smile, tip his hat back and answer, "Yeah, darling, we surely did." The story of Cougar Ridge lived on not because of the fight or the fire, but because of two souls who refused to give up. Proof that sometimes, in the roughest corners of the old American West, love could still take root, even in the ashes.